You are kneeling on a clay floor in ancient Egypt, around 1800 BC, where the air smells of dust and drying reeds. In front of you sit two small pots, each packed with grain. One holds emmer wheat, the other holds barley, and in your hand is a clay cup of your own urine, still warm. You pour it slowly over the wheat, then pour the rest over the barley. Then you cover both pots, tie a cloth over the top, and you wait. Days pass, and you check them every morning before the house wakes. If the wheat sprouts, they say you are carrying a girl. If the barley sprouts, a boy. If neither grows, you are not pregnant at all. Which sounds like nonsense, honestly. And yet this was a folk tale. It was written down by doctors and used for centuries. It crossed empires and survived the fall of Rome. And when modern scientists finally tested it, the results made everyone very uncomfortable. So, what was actually going on here? How did anyone, 4,000 years ago, with zero equipment and zero chemistry, manage to detect pregnancy from a pot of grain? And more importantly, what did women do before the little plastic stick existed? Because the answer turns out to be one of the strangest detective stories in the history of medicine. It is a story about urine, mice, frogs, garlic, and a single molecule that changed the course of human reproduction. And it says a lot about how much and how little has changed. By the end of this video, I'll never look at a pregnancy test the same way again. That is a promise. The stick is new. The waiting is ancient. The fear, the hope, the counting of days, that part is older than writing itself, and the method buried inside that piece of plastic, the molecule it hunts for, the fluid it reads, all of it came out of accident and desperation. Over thousands of years, the story has heroes and victims, geniuses and charlatans, and at the center of it all is a question every woman in history has asked at some point. Am I? Now we finally get to see how they found the answer. Here is what most of us assume. Pregnancy tests are a modern miracle, invented in the last 100 years by people in white coats holding beakers. And that is half true. The plastic is modern. The chemistry is modern. The pink line is modern. But the core idea that a pregnant woman's urine is special, that it can change living things, that it leaves a trace, that idea is older than the pyramids themselves. You can date it to the exact moment someone first poured urine on grain and watched it grow. And once you see that moment, the whole history of medicine snaps into focus. Because most medical progress is a straight line. It is a spiral. We keep coming back to the same fluids, the same questions, with better tools each time. Let's start with the wheat and the barley. The instructions survive in a document called the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, written in Egypt around 1825 BC. It is one of the oldest medical texts in the world. It deals with fertility, contraception, and pregnancy. And right in the middle of it, there is a recipe. To know whether a woman will bear a child, pour her urine over emmer wheat and barley. If they grow, she will bear. If they don't, she will not. No hedging, no maybe. It is written like a lab manual, 4,000 years before the word lab meant anything. And this wasn't a one-off note. A similar version shows up in the Berlin Papyrus. A few centuries later, same test, same grain, same confidence. Two independent manuscripts, both treating urine as a diagnostic fluid. That is a tradition, not a rumor. Somebody in ancient Egypt had watched this work, and word spread from physician to physician for generations. The test didn't stay in Egypt. It traveled the way all good gossip does, slowly and in the mouths of people who couldn't quite keep the details straight. Greek medical writers passed along versions of it, rewording the recipe and keeping the logic. Roman encyclopedists copied it into their books, and by the time it reached medieval Europe, it had been translated, rearranged, and slightly mangled. But the core survived: urine, grain, and a verdict. That kind of staying power is rare in medicine. Most old treatments died because they never were. This one kept getting copied for 2,000 years. Either doctors were idiots for 2,000 years straight, or the test was doing something real some of the time. The 1963 result suggests it was the second one, and that single fact that a superstition can carry a signal is the key to the whole story. Now, a modern reaction to this is usually a laugh. That is magic, not medicine. But here is the thing. In 1963, a physician named Paul Gynecological, working with two colleagues at Cairo University, actually ran the old test. They collected urine from pregnant and non-pregnant women and poured it over barley and wheat. And they found something that made the ancient Egyptians look a lot less crazy than we like. The test was correct roughly 70% of the time. Not perfect, not magic, but 70%, 4,000 years before anyone knew what a hormone was. That is not nothing. That is a signal hiding inside a superstition. And it raises a question that still haunts medicine today. How many things do we dismiss as ancient nonsense when they actually early versions of tests we still use? Why would it work? Here is the science. And it is the science running through the entire story. When a woman becomes pregnant, her body starts producing a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG for short. Along with estrogen and a few other companions, it spills into her urine. And hormones, it turns out, are chemical messengers with a loud voice. Plants listen to them, and estrogen can stimulate seed germination. In the right doses, urine from a pregnant woman makes grain sprout faster than urine from anyone else. The ancient Egyptians didn't know any of this. They didn't know the word hormone, but they noticed that sometimes the grain grew, and they built an entire system on that pattern. That is what diagnosis looked like before instruments. Pattern matching, with the human body as the laboratory and the garden as the readout. The same logic runs through medical history like a spine. Once you know urine carries secrets, you can unsee it. For 2,000 years, doctors stared into flasks of it. Medieval physicians called it uroscopy, and they took it seriously enough to write entire textbooks about the color, smell, and texture of your pee. They drew color charts for it, with little vials of painted glass to compare against. They sniffed it, swirled it, and in some very unfortunate cases, tasted it. They claimed it could diagnose everything from leprosy to heartbreak to whether you'd been unfaithful. Most of that was garbage, but buried under the garbage was a real signal. Pregnancy leaves a fingerprint in urine. The only problem was learning to read it without reading everything else into it. By the 1600s, urine diagnosis had grown into a full industry. And with the industry came the frauds. Quacks called themselves peace prophets and claimed they could read your entire life from a flask of pee. In 1637, a physician named Thomas Bryan published a whole book attacking them with the glorious title, The Peace Prophet. He was furious about the charlatans who sold diagnoses to desperate people. But here is the irony. Bryan was right that most of it was fraud, and the fraud was dangerous. Yet the reason the fraud existed at all was that urine really does carry information. The prophets were reading tea leaves, but the tea leaves were real. They just didn't know which leaves meant what. The Greeks took a different route entirely. In the Hippocratic Corpus, written around the 5th century BC, there is a famous fertility test. Place a clove of garlic inside the woman's body and leave it overnight. In the morning, if her breath smells of garlic, she is open and she can conceive. If there is no smell, the way is blocked. Sounds bizarre, probably was. But look at what is actually happening here. They retesting for a connection between the inside and the outside, between a hidden organ and an observable sign, between what a body keeps and what a body gives away. That is the whole game of diagnosis. Right there, in a garlic clove, crude, invasive, and often wrong. But the logic is sound. Something hidden leaves a trace, and if you find the trace, you found the truth. The Greeks were just working with the traces they could find, and then there is quickening. For most of human history, the single most reliable sign of pregnancy was simply feeling the baby move. Women called it quickening, the first flutter of life, and it usually arrives between 16 and 20 weeks. Midwives knew it, grandmothers knew it, kings' physicians knew it. It wasn't a test you could buy. It was a test you could feel from the inside. And it is still, technically, one of the most trustworthy signs there is. But here is the problem. 16 weeks is 4 months. For a woman who needs to know sooner, for any reason at all, 4 months is an eternity. A missed period could mean 100 things. Nausea could mean bad fish. Tiredness could mean hard work. So the pressure to detect pregnancy early is not a modern invention. It is ancient. Kings wanted heirs, and families wanted certainty. Women wanted to know what their bodies were doing, and they wanted to know now. That pressure built up for centuries, and it finally broke open in the 20th century in a series of experiments that were equal parts genius and horror. Back in 1928, 2 German researchers named Selma Aschheim and Bernhard Zondek made a breakthrough. They injected urine from pregnant women into immature female mice. Days later, they dissected the mice and found that their ovaries had swollen and triggered into activity. The urine had spoken. The mice had answered. For the first time ever, pregnancy could be confirmed in a laboratory weeks before quickening. It was a revolution. The only catch, to read the result, you had to cut the mice open. Every single test meant sacrificing 5 mice. Laboratories began breeding mice by the thousands, just to diagnose women they would never meet. It worked, and nobody loved it, especially not the mice, but it opened a door. The same urine that made Egyptian grain sprout had made a mouse ovary wake up. The signal was real. The signal was chemical. And now, finally, people could name it. The molecule, it turned out, was hiding in plain sight. Aschheim and Zondek didn't just build the mouse test. They also helped isolate the very hormone responsible, HCG, and they realized something strange. Pregnant urine isn't just a little different. It is wildly different. The placenta pumps out this hormone like a factory, and the body doesn't waste it. It pours into the blood, the kidneys filter it out, and out it goes, into a cup, into a pot, into the history of medicine. Once scientists knew the molecule, the race was on to find a cheaper, faster, less murderous way to detect it, and that is where the animals really took over the story. Then came the frogs. In the 1930s, a British zoologist named Lancelot Hogben was studying African clawed frogs, Xenopus laevis. He discovered something delightful. Inject urine from a pregnant woman into a female frog, and the frog ovulates within hours. No dissection, no death, just a frog, a syringe, and a very clear answer. Eggs appear, she is pregnant. No eggs, she is not. The frog test swept the world. Laboratories kept tanks of Xenopus on standby around the clock. One London clinic alone processed tens of thousands of urine samples a year. Doctors mailed patient urine to the frog room like letters. The frogs were kept in rows of tanks, patient, amphibious, and completely unaware they were performing medical miracles. And the frogs, to be clear, never consented to any of this. But they were astonishingly accurate. Think about that for a second. For decades, a huge share of the world's pregnancy tests ran through a species that originally lived in a swamp in sub-Saharan Africa. A frog, hundreds of miles from home, sitting in a tank in a lab, deciding the fate of a family. The Egyptians used grain, the Germans used mice, the British used frogs. Same signal, different ears. And the frogs worked so well that they became the gold standard. When the first modern immunoassay test came along, it had to prove itself to the frogs. The frog was the referee. The frog was the truth. And the women doing the testing, they adapted fast. When the frog test became standard, clinics filled with women, but also with men carrying samples. Husbands brought jars labeled with fake names. Sisters smuggled urine for sisters. Landladies collected samples from tenants and mailed them in, which is a level of neighborhood surveillance we can all be grateful we no longer have. The urine itself was anonymous. The shame was not. A woman who wanted to know her own body often had to lie about whose body it was. The test could say yes or no, but the asking, the risking, the hiding, that part had no test at all. There was even a rabbit version in 1931, the Friedman test, and a toad version that labs in South America swore by. Every continent had a favorite animal. Every animal was basically a bioassay, a living chemistry set, reacting to a molecule nobody had actually seen with their own eyes. And here is the strangest part. All of these animals were reacting to the same thing the Egyptians had been chasing all along. 10 days after conception, HCG shows up in urine. The Egyptians were working with a 4-month delay and a pot of grain. The frog was working with a 10-day delay and a pair of ovaries. Same signal, same story, just faster. The entire arc of pregnancy testing, from papyrus to plastic, is basically one long conversation between humans and their own urine. So now we come back to the ancient question, and it lands differently. The Egyptians poured urine on grain. The Greeks waved garlic around. The Germans killed mice. The British used frogs. And in 1963, Galliangui went back to the wheat and barley, ran the old test, and got his 70%. What does that tell us? It tells us the signal was always there, and it tells us ancient doctors weren't fools. They were pattern finders without instruments, reading the same book with their hands instead of their eyes. And it tells us something else, something that cuts closer to home than any of us like to admit. The people who invented these tests were mostly men. The people who had to live with the results were mostly women. And that gap between who tests and who is tested is one of the oldest power imbalances in medicine. For almost all of human history, the person running the test was the woman herself. There was no kit to buy. There was no lab to visit. She watched her own body like a sailor watches the sky. Missed bleeding. Sore breasts. Nausea at odd hours. The strange quietness of a body that had suddenly become a harbor. She weighed the symptoms. She asked her mother. She asked the midwife. She waited. And the longer she waited, the more the answer mattered, because the answer was never just medical. It was social. It was economic. It was the difference between being a bride and being a liability, between an heir and a disappointment, between keeping your home and losing it. The test was rarely neutral. It was a verdict. And the verdict was delivered by everyone except the woman holding the pot. Modern tests turned that waiting into 90 seconds. You pee on a stick, 2 lines appear, done. It is a miracle. And in one direction, it makes the ancient process look stupid. But the truth is, the stick is just a more elegant frog. It detects the same molecule, HCG, in the same fluid, urine, using the same logic that made wheat sprout and frogs ovulate and mice swell. The only real difference is packaging. And the packaging was a long time coming. The first home test went on sale in 1977, which means that for 99.9% of human existence, the answer did not come from a bathroom counter. It came from a body, usually someone else. S, usually a woman. S, the midwife. S, hands. The grandmother, certainty. The mother, S, memory of what this felt like. For most of history, knowledge about pregnancy lived in women, S, bodies and women, S, communities, passed down by touch and by talk. The stick didn't invent the knowledge. It just made it private. The modern stick is absurdly sensitive by comparison. It can detect HCG at levels as low as 25 milli-international units per milliliter, which is a number that means nothing until you hear this. The Egyptian grain test was working with a flood of hormones. Weeks in, the frog needed a solid dose. The modern stick can catch a pregnancy days before a missed period, when the hormone is barely a whisper. In 1977, when the first home test went on sale in the United States, it cost $10, took 2 hours, and required mixing powders, adding drops, and holding your breath. People still lined up to buy it, because for the first time in history, the answer belonged to the person asking the question, and there is a final twist that makes the whole story uncomfortable in the best way. The ancient test, the 70%, was partly measuring something real, but it was also measuring something social. A woman who pours her urine on grain and watches it fail is carrying a verdict. If nothing sprouts, she is not pregnant, and the world around her reacts accordingly. A pot delivered the verdict. A priest, a doctor. It was delivered to women who had almost no say in what happened next. The test was often less about knowing than about being told. And honestly, some of that hasn't changed. A stick can tell you the chemistry in 90 seconds. It can tell you what to hope for. It can tell you what your family will say. It can tell you whether you are ready. The molecule is the same as it was 4,000 years ago. The question is still yours. So the next time you see a little plastic stick, give it a second thought. That stick is a time traveler. It carries the ghost of a papyrus, a clove of garlic, 5 sacrificed mice, and a frog with a job. It carries the hands of every midwife who ever pressed 2 fingers to a belly and guessed. It carries the patience of every woman who counted the days and tried not to count them again. It carries a 70% guess that turned out to be a real signal, hiding in a pot of grain for 4,000 years waiting for someone to ask the right question. And when you pee on it, you are joining a line that stretches back 4,000 years, all of them holding the same question in their hands. Am I? And waiting for the grain to answer. The grain answers in about 90 seconds now. The waiting, that part, never got shorter.